So here's what I am planning. I want to, first of all, introduce an ancient philosophical debate, and then I will say why I think this is so important for understanding life, focusing particularly on organisms, and then perhaps some of you might expect I would then move on to genes. I actually want to move in the other direction and talk about lineages or species, and how they should be seen in a process way. And then finally, for about the second half of the talk, I will try and explore some implications for humans. First, some general ideas about how we should think of the human species, and then some more specific implications for problems that are of more immediate practical concern, particularly concerning the classification of humans. So rather a lot to cover, but I hope I will at least get a sense, and I guess my hope is that I will not only explain this philosophical view, but also give you some sense of why it might actually matter. Okay, so let me start off with the most general background to my work. The distinction between a substance, as philosophers like to call it, I prefer just to talk about things, and a process view of the world. This goes back to the dawn of Western philosophy, and I should perhaps say, when I say the dawn, I don't mean it's the dawn of philosophy, it's the dawn of the tradition of philosophy that I was brought up in, starting with the Greeks. The Greeks, some of you will know, give a lot of credit for where they started to Egyptian philosophy that had been alive for about 2,000 years before this, but about which we know rather little, some of it being what the Greeks tell us. So these, on this slide, two of the better-known pre-Socratic Greek philosophers, and some rather conflicting views that they had. So on the one hand, we have Parmenides, who is famous for having said, change is an illusion. There is no change. Everything is basically just what it is and what it always was. And Heraclitus, my personal hero, who said, nothing exists but change. So clearly some contrasting views. Now, the first thing I might say about Parmenides is that seems a silly view because we see things changing all the time. But there is a follower of his who created a view that makes some sense of this, and this is Democritus. Democritus, who I should probably also mention Leucippus, but he's much less well known. Democritus, a little while after Parmenides, introduced into Greek philosophy, or took from Leucippus, the idea that there is nothing in the world except atoms and the void. Atoms don't change. So what the fundamentally is doesn't change. There's just a certain number of atoms. They just rearrange themselves into different shapes and form different things. So this is, I think, a debate that has echoed through the tradition of philosophy as I learnt it. And then I move on about best part of 2,000 years, so I'm not a historian, as you can see, to the scientific revolution. And what I basically want to say here is that Parmenides, broadly speaking, won at this point. The view of a world of atoms, unchanging atoms in the void, was accepted by the emerging scientists in the 17th century. And here's a quote from one of the leading figures there, Robert Boyle, who said, The naturalist, that means a scientist, in explicating particular phenomena considers only the size, shape, motion or want of it, texture, and the resulting quantities and attributes of the small particles of matter. So if we want to understand how something works, what it does, we try and figure out how the atoms in it are arranged, because they're the reality, the rest is just a temporary pattern that is of no real scientific importance. And what underlies a whole lot of my work in recent years is the idea that Parmenides' victory here was actually a disaster for the future study of biology. Now, that's probably an exaggeration because atomism has been very productive. It's given us genetics and all kinds of good things, but it's basically wrong, and we're beginning, as it develops, to see ways in which it has led us to misunderstand some very fundamental things. So, let me just now try and explain roughly what is at stake. So, the Parmenidean, Democritean view has a world of things. There are atoms, and then there are these composites of atoms into these more complex things. There are various views about things, and again, just for philosophers, I mentioned the word substances, which is a more technical term. Substances also, there's no great agreement about what they are, and things is suitably vague, and what I'm pointing to here is some very dominant themes in the way people have thought about these constituents of the world. So the world is composed of things. These things have properties, again, all reducible to the atoms that compose them, and specifically they have essential properties, properties that make them a particular kind of things. So other properties can change, but once the essential property no longer applies, the thing no longer exists. And this answers a question which was very fundamental to this way of thinking as to how things, what it was for things to persist. Things are thought of as autonomous. Theoretically, there might just be one atom in the universe and nothing else. Certainly, there might be just one table or one planet. These are examples I've given. And these things also have reasonably firm boundaries, sharp boundaries. Not absolutely, but pretty much you know where a table begins and where it ends. And finally, and this is particularly important, if in the default state of a thing is stasis, it doesn't do anything unless something makes it do something. So science is typically about explaining why things change, why they leave their static state. And so I have some examples there. Here's a questionable example, and I want to explore whether that fits in this category of a thing. Now, process, which I defined partly in opposition to this, is dynamic, always dynamic. And what we think of as things are eddies in this more fundamental flux of process, ever-changing, as Heraclitus told us. And in fact, it is their stability rather than their changes that require explanation. Remember the last slide, I actually had a picture of the planet Jupiter. I now have a close-up of the red spot, the great red spot on Jupiter, which is actually a kind of paradigm for me of a process. It's been there for at least 150 years, probably much longer, and it looks like, a sort of thing on the surface of the planet, but actually it's a storm. It's a massive storm, and it's sustained by winds of about 600 kilometers an hour that go round it, and this process has kept it going for all this time. If the wind stopped, it would just dissipate. There would be no more spot. So its stability depends actually on its internal nature, but also on its surroundings. And partly for that reason, typically a process that has vague boundaries. Where does the wind stop and the spot end? There's really no good answer to that. So processes require activity for their continued existence, and that contrasts with the point about stasis. And again, we can ask whether organisms fit under this kind of general description, to which I now turn. So, let me say something about it. Now, organisms have, in fact, since Aristotle, been a kind of paradigm example of complex contents of the world, and have been defined broadly in terms of this set of views about substances. But there are at least three reasons why we should think of organisms as processes, and I'll just go briefly through these in a moment, but here I just list them. They're metabolic processes, developmental processes, and symbiotic systems, and I'll explain what I mean by these. So let me start off. This is a very familiar view of, idea about organisms. Scientists like to say they're thermodynamically open systems, far from equilibrium. You are not in equilibrium with your environment. You won't be until you've been dead for a while. And that's just, and in fact, every second there are actually trillions of little events inside you which maintain you in this disequilibrium state. So very far removed from this idea of a thing, the default of which is stasis. And they are not autonomous. If they're not in an environment which provides them with air, water, food, they quickly cease to be stable structures, and they are no more. So they're not stable by default, far from it. And secondly, organisms are developmental processes. Organisms have life cycles. They don't have any constant property that's even a candidate for being an essential property that defines their continued existence. So unless we want to say that, the tadpole dies and a frog appears from somewhere, which is not how we normally think of it. We normally think of one organism that was once a tadpole and is now a frog, but these are very different. Like I said, larva and a beetle there, same example. So really we need to identify the organism with this entire life cycle from a fertilized egg to death. And I think the way, and I won't go into this, but I'll just throw it out, the way one should think of organisms over time is through causal continuity, that one stage of the process causes the next stage, rather than in terms of anything like stable continued properties, still less essences. Finally, and this is actually the line of thought that led me into process thinking, everywhere in life there is symbiosis. The stabilization of organisms is achieved by their internal processes, but also by cooperative relations with other organisms. And I give some examples. You probably know now that you have something like 10 to the 14, that's 1,000 trillion, quadrillion, is that? Symbiotic microbes associated with your body, many of which are essential for your well-being. And we can talk about the digestive system of a cow, or an example I very much like, the plant roots, partly because, as we now know, you might have heard people talk about the wood wide web, that actually when you see a mushroom, you're not seeing an independent autonomous organism, you're seeing something that comes up of a web of mycelial fibers in the soil that actually connects many plants together, enables them to pass nutrients from one to the other. It's a massively cooperative thing. So I want to say few, if any, organisms are even close to being autonomous. So a final general point I want to make about processes is, as the example of as the phenomenon of symbiosis shows, processes become entangled with one another. And in many cases, it's their entanglement that enables them to persist and carry on. And these examples that I've got on the slide are just to get a sense of the fact that processes are constantly changing their boundaries as they interact with their environment. And And I like to come back to rivers, just in memory of Heraclitus, who famously probably didn't say, you never step in the same river twice, but everybody says he did. And a river is a wonderful example, because a river is a process of water flowing down towards the sea. But if you look at a river, where's a tributary? How wide does it have to be to become a lake? Where does the river end and the lake begin? And you can go on like this. It's very hard to say where the distinct things are. Okay. Now, as I said, after organisms, the other biological category that really interests me greatly are lineages. And I'll try and explain why those are so interesting. So the question that introduces lineage is the question, what evolves? And we talk loosely about humans evolved, but no human has ever evolved. You will not evolve however long you live. Evolution is a phenomenon that happens at the level of series of organisms related in this ancestral descendant way, and evolution happens when the properties within the lineage change over time. So, as a matter of fact, they've got a little picture of one of the founders of what's called the modern synthesis, still the sort of dominant view of evolution. This is George Gaylord Simpson, and he defines a species. And let me just back up a moment. There's a complex relationship between the concept of a lineage and a species. And as I note at the bottom, a species can consist of several populations, and species don't apply to all organisms. It's hard to define a species of bacteria. All of that's fairly irrelevant at the moment, because I'm interested in moving towards humans. But also, I should say that, so for simplification, I'm just going to talk as if a species and a lineage are the same thing, or at least a lineage is composed of species. A lineage is a series of species, and if one traces human origins back to some primordial slime, most of the way one's just got a series of species. So that's a very long lineage. Okay. Right. So what is a species? The most famous debate when I was first doing philosophy of biology for about 20 years at any rate, was between people who thought, as many of you may well, that species is a classificatory term. And by the way, I think it is that too. But what these two people here, Michael Gieslin and David Howe, argued was that actually we should think of species as a kind of individual. And lots of people said, that's stupid. You can't have an individual where the parts, some of them might be in Australia and some of them might be in Europe, and many people thought this must be nonsense. But on the whole, biologists accepted it because they thought of species in relation to the tree of life, the phylogenetic history of life, and species as little twigs at the end of this. And a twig is a thing, so it looks as if a species is a thing. I think the solution to this sort of dilemma is to recognize that species are actually not a kind of thing, but a kind of process. And of course, a lineage clearly doesn't exist unless it's doing something. A lineage exists by reproducing itself, by producing new members of the species and so on. So I think once you see that a lineage is a process, evolution is something that happens to these processes, a kind of change that happens within them, and of course happens constantly in response to the environment with which they are deeply intertwined, as any biologist will now tell you, is, I think, a fairly straightforward way of seeing all this. I said, introducing processes, that you ask a somewhat different question. The question you tend to ask about a process is how it remains stable, how it exists. And of course, lineages have existed for billions of years. And what maintains this stability, either just for the species at a time, but over the whole sequence of species over geological or biological time. And this is something I would just throw out in passing. I think that the real most important thing about natural selection, and I think Darwin would not be totally opposed to this, is that they stabilize lineages by massive overproduction of offspring and then by selecting the ones that are fit to carry on the species. But that's another topic. The more relevant species, you may have heard species defined as reproductively isolated groups of organisms. I think that species, as we know them, actually came into being with sexual reproduction, which enabled the isolation of a species, the coherence of a lineage through time in a way that was not easily possible before, though that's a very complex argument. And finally, through cooperation. And that, I think, is the ultimate, most coherent, most organized form of a species. And the absolutely prime example of that is the human species. And that leads me on to the humans. And I just make a sort of this parenthesis to the subtitle, to the title of this section. I'm kind of interested in whether this is an argument for human exceptionalism. I do think humans are, I think people are afraid of saying humans are kind of unique, and this is associated with all kinds of different things. But humans have taken certain evolutionary tendencies so far that, as one famous philosopher might have said, a difference of degree has become a difference of kind. But all I want to say is that I think this is a lot to say about what's exceptional about humans, though perhaps not as much as some people might like. So let me start with humans, with human development. And in particular, I want to emphasize developmental plasticity. And this is something that is, all organisms have some degree of developmental plasticity, which again is a very processual idea, I think. But I think that in terms of a particular dimension of plasticity, humans have taken this to a new degree. And in particular, I mean behavioral plasticity. I like to think plants do physiological plasticity more than anything else, and perhaps bacteria do chemical plasticity, which is why we still depend on them so much. But we do behavioral plasticity, which is the whole point of being an animal, I think. And when we look at this, you see that certainly in the human case and in other cases, there are many factors that affect this development of behavior. So, of course, there are genetic differences, also epigenetics, which many of you will know about. I'll talk about that if anybody wants in the discussion, but I think that would be difficult now. The upbringing, your environment, has a great deal to do with your developmental trajectory. You may also affect it yourself by the way you behave, though that again is another topic which I'm happy to talk about, but I won't go into here. But also the wider social and physical environment, which I'll mention in a moment, under a very important topic in recent biology, niche construction. But before that, I want to talk about, yeah, sorry, I didn't think I'd done that. It's horrible, sorry. So, if you look at human societies, perhaps the thing that is most unique about them is the division of labor. It's an absolutely decisive factor in contemporary human lineages. And of course, the division of labor that we have requires remarkable developmental plasticity in behavioral capacities. You know, people come to be able to do all sorts of things, even weird things like standing up and saying you're talking about philosophy. I mean, that's a very, very particular developmental trajectory. I think, and this kind of anticipates the final parts of my talk, many political and social problems come about because we understand the division of labor in terms of different kinds of people, kinds of thing with different essential properties, workers, women, manual versus professional workers, etc., rather than different developmental histories. And I have a source for this which I really love in the history of actually British philosophy, somebody, Adam Smith, who is sometimes thought of in very different ways. But here is, Adam Smith is greatly maligned as he has been taken over by a political interest that is not exactly mine. But here's something that Adam Smith says: the difference of natural talents in different men, sorry for the sexist, but he was in the 18th century, is in reality much less than we are aware of. And the very different genius which appears to distinguish men of different professions when grown up to maturity is not upon many occasions so much the cause as the effect of the division of labour. The difference between the most dissimilar characters, between a philosopher and a common street porter, for example, seems to arise not so much from nature as from habit, custom, and education. When they came into the world, and for the first 6 or 8 years of their existence, they were perhaps very much alike, and neither their parents nor playfellows could perceive any remarkable difference. About that age, or soon after, they come to be employed in very different occupations. The difference of talents then comes to be taken notice of, and widens by degrees, till at last the vanity of the philosopher is willing to acknowledge scarce any resemblance. Well, I will do my best to overcome this. But I think, this is a perfect statement of developmental plasticity of a kind that we all too little understand. And I think that it comes from this particular source is particularly wonderful. I will come back to this topic. But first, I just want to briefly mention one other crucial factor in human lineages. Again, something that is very important in contemporary biology: niche construction. Every organism does this. They change their environment, and this is a really important fact in understanding evolution, because we tend to talk as if evolving lineages just respond to an environment in a passive way, but of course it's a two-way process. They change their environments, and here's an extreme example at the top of beavers building dams and creating a whole different landscape. But none of this compares to what we do in creating our own environments which enable the ways we developed. And I just, because as extreme examples of this are the existence of hospitals that obviously keep us alive, and the existence of schools that enable us to come to fill these many roles in the complex division of labor. So summarizing the unique features of the human species, we're uniquely evolved in our behavioral plasticity, enabling the division of labor and the construction of complex niches. And in this regard, the other kind of our rivals probably are the social insects. And if they're, fortunately, they're very small, or we'd be having terrible troubles with them, and we do sometimes anyway. But these features permit a unique sociality and social cohesion. And I think one of the things that, again, is very striking, and again why I love to cite Adam Smith here, is that this makes so strange and ironic the dominant ideology of individualism, of autonomous, separate individuals. No organism on the planet is more thoroughly dependent on conspecifics than we are. And just look around you, look at what you're wearing, what you ate for, it's very obvious. But people somehow seem, except I guess in COVID when we've discovered essential workers, but we've now forgotten that already, at least where I come from. Okay, so I move on to humankinds. And obviously this sets up the idea that humans are extremely diverse in their behaviors and lifestyles, and so there are multiple ways of dividing them into different kinds. Just leave a few here. The features that form the basis of these classifications have many causes, and there are many effects of having these features and being classified in these ways. And some people are familiar with Ian Hacking's work, who I believe has been here as a visitor, so some of you may even have heard him speak, who talks about the way that identifying people as a kind actually changes them in very fundamental ways. So I think we should be very suspicious of general claims about the implications of belonging to these human kinds. There is, as I sometimes say, diversity all the way down. Okay, so let me now talk very briefly, obviously because these are huge issues, about the two perhaps most fundamental ways in which we tend to think of ourselves as divided into different kinds, and start off with sex and gender. Now, of course, something that's very easy to understand as a process philosopher is that the sequence, the developmental sequence from, I've mentioned I don't know I should use the genotypes. Really, the process perhaps begins more fundamentally at the identification at birth of belonging to one kind or the other. But at any rate, there's a long process to becoming a normatively gendered man or woman. And again, I think we're all quite familiar with this idea by now. And many factors contribute to stabilizing these typical trajectories towards these normative outcomes. So it includes genes, hormones, brains, parenting, the wider culture, and much else. There's a lot of variation along this trajectory, and therefore a diverse set of possible outcomes, which are widely studied in many areas of the academy now. And I should say, I say sex gender, as I talk about, and I here follow the feminist biologist Anne Fausto Sterling, who's done, I think, the best work on the biology of sex and gender, as biological sex and normative gender do usually go together, but not always, and there's a huge diversity in the expression of gender. So what I wanted now to, oh, sorry, that was supposed to come on in bits, but never mind. I just wanted to give one little example of a kind of, very simple element of the different environment, and I came across this lovely work by a Korean artist who looked at children and collected their toys at various ages, and she's got a bunch of these pictures and noted that you probably can see a difference. I'm sorry if there are people who don't see colour, but one's pink and one's blue in a very clear way. And as I say, just as a nice example, and it's a nice example also because it actually, some of you may well know, pink was considered a totally masculine colour until about middle of the 20th century, and you can find advice telling people exactly the opposite. Give your boys pink things and give your kids blue things. It also turns out that even in cultures that are fully signed up to this, by the time you get to be about a teenager, everybody likes blue better, pretty much. But all of this is just to say there's a totally arbitrary ways in which we have these different trajectories. And I do notice that this can go on a bit longer. I was rather pleased to find this little picture of the German Olympic team a few years ago, which has... Okay. So here's obviously getting back to my theme. So descriptions of gender difference between boys and girls, men and women, are typically understood, or quite widely understood, as describing different kinds of things. Probably not an audience as sophisticated as here, but in the wider public, and even the best-selling book of a decade was this one, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, saying what very different kinds of things these were. But of course, what we really see in these stereotypes are just snapshots of a particular stage in a very contingent and highly variable process of gender differentiation. And I think this is a really important misunderstanding, and one that I think really stems from some very deep philosophical misunderstandings of what the world is like. And this, of course, science is not above all this. And here's a little thing I came across a few years ago, which is an announcement in The Guardian, which I rather like to all see in pictures like this. So it says, Rajini Verma, a researcher at the University of Pennsylvania, said the greatest surprise was how much the findings supported old stereotypes, with men's brains apparently wired more for perception and coordinated actions than women's for social skills and memory, making them better equipped for multitasking. So I guess science shows it is just different kinds of things with different essential properties. And I really have just one comment on this. Why do you assume the wiring of the brain is a cause rather than effect of gender difference? With all these differences going in, So what a surprise that you find differently wired brains at the end of it. I mean, it's just, and so the interesting thing is how people come to think that this is a reasonable and obvious interpretation of this data. And I think the answer is because we have a framework in which we think. And here I had to be very quick because this is a rather complicated slide in the end, but I think the picture is we have a lot of, there's something I haven't talked about, but which I have thought about a lot. We have these evolutionary stories about how males and females become sent down different channels, and they do this by getting specific genes that make their brains different and make the behavior come out in particular ways. And again, I would be really quick with all this mess I want to add on. And I was going to say, all of these things are subject to many other influences, environmental influences of various kinds. And I think even more interestingly, it's the linearity. There's no, the upward arrows are just as important as the downward arrows. And so, of course, when I say gender-specific behavior causes sexually differentiated brains, I mean, how the two processes balance is hard to say precisely, but certainly that is going to happen. And so, so I say the model somehow marginalizes environmental influences. It just talks about the internal nature of this thing that's undergoing this emergence. And I say all of these, and again, as this is hopelessly linear, whereas actual causal patterns in biology are just not like that. Everything tends to go both ways, which is, makes life very difficult, but it's just how it is. Okay, so now I get on to my last topic and just say something very little, I should say, because obviously there's a lot going on here. But what I want to look at is, again, ways in which this biological picture, this kind of, which ultimately I would call a philosophical picture, affects the way people understand the world. And I would say sometimes in a quite detrimental way. So here's a quote from a journalist, but a pretty respected one. He's been a correspondent for science and nature, and so I mean, sort of reputable. So he says, analysis of genomes from around the world established that there is a biological basis for race, despite the official statements to the contrary of leading social science organizations. And many of you will know social scientists and humanists have on the whole said race is a social construction. Now, of course, it's complicated here because social constructions are not unreal, but when we talk about real, we tend to be, in this context, we're talking about, but is it something biologically out there? Really meaning, is it something we couldn't do anything differently with because it's out there in the genes or something? So an illustration of this point is the fact that with mixed race populations, such as African Americans, geneticists can now track along an individual's genome and assign each segment to an African or European ancestor, an exercise that would be impossible if race did not have some basis in biological reality. I'll come back to this quote in a moment, but first I want to just say something about where this comes from. So there's a typical piece of scientific work. This is a classic example from 2002 where a number of researchers took biological material from a lot of people, about 1,000 people from various parts of the world, and they used a program to analyze this. The program is called structure. And what you do with structure is you say, cluster this into 3 groups, and it comes out with some set of clusters. And in fact, if you put n equals 4, you will say 4 groups, you come out more or less with Africans, Asians, Europeans, and Native Americans. And then you add 5, and Oceania splits off from Asia, and that's maybe one way you want to see it. Here's a picture from the paper, and what I just want to say, where does this come from? Well, basically what you're mapping here is the history of certain major human migrations. So as we all know, we all came out of Africa. We don't know exactly how long ago. Well, actually, most of us, of course, didn't. A few of us came out of Africa and then spread gradually around the globe. And because The genome is a part of a dynamic process, perhaps a dynamic process in itself. The longer it goes on, the more changes it accumulates. Actually, this study is looking at specifically at non-functional bits of the genome because those are the ones that you can see just drifting. And they actually drift quite a bit. And the longer you've been separated from another distant population, the further they drift. So it's not too surprising that it's not actually unambiguous, though later programs are a bit more reliable. But generally, first of all, you get Africa and essentially the rest, though that tends to be focused on the Americas because they're furthest away. And then you split off either Eurasia or Southeast Asia, either Eurasia from Africa or Southeast Asia from the Americas. They can go in either direction depending how many times you run the program. And then you get Oceania, and then it all falls apart. Actually, the next one you get on this piece of work was the Kailash people of northwest Pakistan, numbering about 4,000. So that's just an anomaly. But so you might think, okay, here's scientific evidence that you can sort of look at a genome and you can tell which race somebody belongs to. Well, of course, the first thing is to say, what you're finding out about is historical origin, something about where your ancestors lived in the past. And the second thing, I mean, is that this is such a partial picture. People move around all the time. And one way of saying this, that I should just was thinking about today when I was trying to figure out how to explain something so complicated, is one thing we all know is actually most of the human genetic diversity is in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, because actually only a very small population, or possibly a series of small populations, left Africa. Now that has various consequences because it's a small population. Actually, that's well known to geneticists, means you get a lot of drift. And so in these particular kind of non-functional markers, you get a lot of change, and it becomes quite easy to track these histories. Of course, there are backward migrations. People are moving backwards and forwards all the time, so things are getting quite complicated. I also was curious, nothing happens inside Africa. That's just something. Actually, if you look up recently, one reason for that is until recently, nobody had done much of this kind of genetics, but nowadays they will say there are probably 13 ancestral populations in Africa. Mostly they are pretty mixed up, so it's quite hard to track down where everybody came from, but some of them are quite separated, and of course there are still places where they come into into quite hostile relations with one another, as unfortunately. So I guess what I'm saying is we're looking at something quite different. We're looking at this process of groups of people moving around. We're tracking those movements, and then we are reifying them into different kinds of people. And this is, again, I think, something that happens. Reification is a word that I like a lot, obviously. This is the process of looking at a temporally stable bit of a process and thinking it's a kind of thing. So where does this leave us? And I should say that actually Rosenberg says here something which famously was said by Richard Lewontin, the very world-famous geneticist in about the 1970s, who did the first study of this kind, and he said the average proportion of genetic differences between individuals from different human populations only slightly exceeds that between unrelated individuals from a single population. So that's to say, sorting people according to what you think of as their race tells you only a very little bit about their genetic differences, and that little bit is, as I say, more or less what they've accumulated in their travels. So our race is real, and again, obviously what I mean here, in the sense that people want to say it's a biological reality. What I want to say is the residue of ancestral origin. Humans travel a lot, sometimes lots of them, carrying genetic markers. These migratory populations are transitory lineages within the the overall human lineages. Generally, migratory populations merge into the wider population fairly rapidly, so they're not identifiable. I believe that my name comes from a Huguenot ancestor. Lots of Huguenots left France in 1700, and some of them, I believe, live up the road in Franschhoek. But on the whole, it's very hard to find them. You probably could, if you really wanted to, find some genetic markers that would confirm or not confirm that somewhere I had a Huguenot ancestor. Why you would want to do that, I don't know. But anyhow, but here's I think the interesting thing, or some way interesting, that what would make these flows of people maintain a coherence as lineages is barriers to integration, particularly to reproduction. And this will slow down integration and stabilize the sublineage at a certain time. And this will allow systematic differences in the way people are treated, the opportunities they have, and so on, and hence differences in behavior. And I think this is the sense in which it is absolutely true to say that racism causes race rather than vice versa. That racism stabilizes lineages of migratory peoples in ways that enables them to be identifiable as continuing entities and tempts people to think that we've got fundamentally different kinds of people. So biological race, I say, is the static, frozen legacy of this historical process of migration. And of course, I should add, none of this makes it as if we all understood that, we would immediately abolish racial distinctions the week after next. But I think that perhaps in the next century, we might aim to do this. Let me just come back to this quote I started with, this bit of discussion, and just at the end of it. So geneticists can now track along an individual's genome and assign each segment to an African or European ancestor. Now, how bizarre is that? I mean, genomes are inherited. You pass them down. If you have a European ancestor and an African ancestor, there's probably bits of your genome that you inherited from each of those ancestors, and for the reasons I've briefly described, there are probably things in the genome that will enable you to identify them. So, I mean, there are huge complexities. So how big is a segment? Because if you go down to small enough segments, then you certainly can't identify them. You might have to get quite a big segment to identify it, but they all came from whatever ancestors you had. So it says, an exercise that would be impossible if race did not have some basis in biological reality. That seems to me a blinding non sequitur. It just said, if you didn't have ancestors, then you couldn't have markers in your genome saying which of them you were responsible for different little features of your genome. So I think we can, I hope that is clear how, again, and I leave it as an exercise for the listener to work out why I think this is a kind of reification and becomes much easier to see through in a process world. So I should say, Wade does say some rather unfortunate things in this article that I say, but he also says the overwhelming verdict of the genome is to declare the basic unity of humankind. So perhaps we should forgive him for some of the things he says along the way. So really what we, I think, have in a way is where races survive as easily identifiable sub-parts of the population, we really have cultural kinds rather than biological kinds. And cultural kinds, I think, are something really interesting that certainly happens because we classify people in all kinds of ways, mostly not thinking that we're doing biology, but these ground lineages. It could have been that the Huguenots all stuck together and made the things that Huguenots make, and we could contribute little bits of Huguenot culture to the world, which I'm sure we did in the past. But as with races, whether these sub-processes persist essentially depends on how how strong the barriers are between them and the rest of the world. And it may well be that some of these barriers are good things. I mean, they enable these cultures to persist and produce different, unique things. Certainly, prior to globalizations, I think many national identities formed fairly robust cultural lineages, and I don't mean to make this sound as if I'm a big fan of contemporary nationalism, but perhaps this is, the best that you can say for what some of these people are doing. Now, I want to end with a rather curious question, because I think cultural kinds are interesting, and it occurred to me while I was doing this that, well, cultural kinds can actually direct to some degree their own evolution. We can have the Council of Huguenots who come together and say, we're going to be really nice, we're going to do great things, and we could become the nicest people in the world because we all said we're going to live by this wonderful code. Might not work, but at any rate, it's something that we can, to some degree, direct the evolution of a cultural kind. And I saw the question, well, could the human species become a cultural kind in this end and direct its own evolution? And you may not be surprised at the thing that put this in mind. I spoke of niche construction. Construction here is a rather neutral term. I mean, all organisms affect their environment. We are now famously engaged in a catastrophic process of niche destruction, which may well actually wipe us off the planet in the not very distant future. It would be a good idea if we could think of ourselves as a lineage and somehow direct that lineage in a way that might possibly forestall this outcome. And with that thought, I was reminded of a rather lovely bit of process lineage thinking that I came across actually from Native American philosophy, and I will read this because I like it very much. If you ask me what is the most important thing that I've learned about being a Haudenosaunee, it's the idea that we are connected to a community, but a community that transcends time. We're connected to the first Indians who walked on this earth, the very first ones, however long ago that was. But we're also connected to those Indians who aren't even born yet, who are going to walk this earth. And our job in the middle is to bridge that gap. You take the inheritance from the past, you add to it your ideas and your thinking, and you bundle it up and shoot it to the future. You come here to work hard so that the future can enjoy that benefit. And it seemed to me this is actually precisely how we should think about a lineage that we're part of. Whether we could come to think about that of the big lineage, I don't know, but it's a nice thought. So I will conclude. Humans have a place in both a complexly differentiated biological lineage and one or more cultural lineages. Much diversity is to be interpreted in relation to location in such lineages rather than merely as species-wide individual variation. But all of these lineages contain much internal variation, and only when they, whether biological or cultural, are unusually isolated from the majority of the human population, at least the population that surrounds them, does lineage membership have much predictive value for properties of individuals. And surely such isolation is now commoner for cultural lineages. And end really pathetically, I thought maybe this highlights the dangers of social media bubbles. And that really is my pathetic end.